Extinct for 70 million years until in the 1950s, they found one still alive. In fact, they've since found a whole schools of them still alive. And lo and behold, the oldest fossil coelacanth is 450 million years old, and it has not changed one iota in 450 million years. The water from a spring comes down over the cliff, drips on the objects, and permineralizes them. It took a whopping 3 months to permineralize this teddy bear. A whole 3 months. Now, this isn't the only thing we have that's permineralized, but I want to show you guys so you get a good close look at this. You can take a close look later on too as well once I got it on display here. So that bear took roughly 3 months to permineralize. Again, it doesn't take thousands or millions of years to make a fossil. It can happen very rapidly. Even the evolutionists have acknowledged that. This is a fossil paper rose. Now, unfortunately, the gentleman who made these comes from Czechoslovakia, and the well that he was making these in, they've now shut down, unfortunately. Because he used to take these, he'd take a paper rose, he would hang it in his well for a whopping 2 weeks. It turns it into stone, and then he sells it to Canadian tourists. So we had a nice system going. So as you can see yourselves there, I'll pass this around. Just be very gentle with it, okay? It is pretty fragile, but I'll pass it around. But again, it doesn't take thousands or millions of years to make a fossil. In fact, petrified wood has been formed in hours. There's actually a patent on the process. There are actually ways to perfect it. The Japanese were the first ones that did it. They just did it in a hot spring. And they were able to make fossil wood literally in hours. Okay, now, coming back to the coelacanth for a second. There's a major point I want to make here, because I'm going to now get into the fossil record, the fossil order, and supposed evidence for evolution from the fossils. We dealt with Archaeopteryx. I'll probably repeat it again just to bring the point home. But what we have in the rock record where the fossils are present, that whole era is called the Phanerozoic. So basically the rock record that contains all the fossils, essentially, that is the Phanerozoic. So it's roughly 550 million years according to the evolutionary timescale that I think is hogwash. So let's take a look at the coelacanth. The coelacanth is found as old as 450 million years old, but vanishes from the fossil record 70 million years ago. It is still alive today. Obviously, we know that it was present during the past 70 million years because it's still alive today, but it was not preserved in the fossil record. This is key. The reason this is key is because we know it was there, but not in the fossil record. Evolutionists will claim that it first appeared here because that's the oldest fossil we have. It had not evolved yet. That is a non sequitur argument. Because we know it was there but not preserved, just because it's not preserved there does not mean it wasn't already around. Do you follow me there? And so evolutionists try and play things up as a sequence in the rock record, and that the sequence of evolution is based on the rock record. It doesn't stack up when you examine it scientifically, because there are many fossils today that vanished from the fossil record anywhere from 2 to 70 to 100 million years ago that are still alive today, but we don't find them in the fossil record. If they're not there when we know they were there, how do we know they were not there in the older rocks? We don't. That's the bottom line. Now, the fossil non-sequence, again, evolutionists like to talk about the sequence in the rock record. They say it matter-of-factly, in fact. Most evolutionists have not stopped to actually examine the supposed fossil sequence. They were taught it as fact, they assume it's fact. The fossil sequence does not exist. It doesn't exist. I'm going to show you why. Number one, and there's some circular reasoning involved here. If we find a certain dinosaur that belongs to the Cretaceous in a rock layer, we then call that rock layer a Cretaceous rock layer. Why? Because it's got Cretaceous dinosaurs in it. Do you see the circularity here? The rocks are dated by the fossils are dated by the rocks. Do you see the circularity there? It's Cretaceous because it's got Cretaceous dinosaurs in it. Well, how do you know those dinosaurs are Cretaceous? Well, because they're in Cretaceous rocks. It's circularity and circular arguments. It doesn't work. So, of course, the geologic ages line up. Now, I want to recommend a paper which is not bad reading. It's not too hard. John Woodmore, again, a fantastic researcher. I had the privilege to get to meet him this past year. In 1983, put out an article called The Diluviological Treatise on the Stratigraphic Separation of Fossils. He was talking about that fossil sequence. Get this, 807 references are what he compiled for that article. 807 when he put together this article. Now, I'll give you a couple of just the main points. The main trend is not the disappearance of families, as we've seen, but actually the appearance of families. However, 1/3 of the fossil families or more spanned at least 3 or more geologic periods. In other words, there's no sequence, there's a huge overlap of every single family, pretty much. 1/3 of them spanned at least 3 or more geological eras. 3 or more. Now, interestingly, a guy by the name of David Raup, who came from the Chicago Field Museum, made this interesting comment in passing. He said, one of the ironies of the creation-evolution debate, and I agree with him on this one, is that the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression of evolution, is what he's suggesting, and they have gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact into their flood geology. In other words, he's acknowledging that the fossil record does not show a detailed and orderly progression. It doesn't. He's even acknowledging it now in print. And what he also points out is the irony that even the creationists have bought into the lie that there's an orderly sequence. And they've tried to fit that orderly sequence into their flood geology. Now, it's true, many fossils do get separated, but as I mentioned previously, dinosaurs and clams are found together in the Morrison Formation at Dinosaur National Monument. What are clams and dinosaurs doing buried together? Simple. They were buried together in a flood. It's pretty simple. Now, before we take a look at the fossil record itself and the supposed evidence for evolution, I want to give you a couple of heads-ups here. In the words of Scientific American, the fossils are set in stone, their interpretation is not. Interpreting fossils is incredibly subjective. Evolutionists will look at the fossils from an evolutionary perspective. Oh, how does this fit into evolution? Creationists will look at it as a unique species. It's that simple. Either could be right. So it's incredibly subjective. However, today we're going to go fossil digging. Now, it's very rare to find a skull, but today not only do we go fossil digging and find a skull, we find a complete skull. Also very rare. We keep digging and we stumble on another skull not too far away. It turns out this skull was actually above the first one we found. Do you think those two are the same creature? Do you think maybe this one evolved into that one? Possibly. It would almost seem like the evidence kind of backs that up, doesn't it? We keep digging, we find 2 complete skeletons. We find this one in the lower strata and this one in the higher strata. Is it possible this one evolved into this one? Maybe. Are they the same creature? What do you think? No? Well, here's the thing. That one's a Great Dane, this one's a Dachshund. They are both the same species. And so, those two skulls I first showed you, again, one's a bulldog, the other's a bourgeois, both dogs. This is the variation you can get within the species. Now, what has got to be the largest collection of dead dogs I've ever seen, published by National Geographic, at least I assume they're dead because I can't figure out how they got a wolf sitting this far away from a chihuahua and he didn't have him for breakfast. So, but this gives you an idea of the variation you can get within a species. And there's been many creationists who have, I think, rightfully complained that all this variation we see within the T-Rex or within the dinosaurs, they're probably all the same species. They're probably all T-Rex, just with a whole pile of variation. Sexual dimorphism, environment, diet, all kinds of changes. Age, all these things change the appearance of the creatures. So, bearing that in mind, before we examine the fossil evidence, here's another wild card which I've alluded to throughout the week. This is in the Canadian Museum of Nature. This display is no longer there, but up in the dinosaur wing, which they've completely renovated now and I haven't gotten to see yet, they did have, tucked away in the corner, a fossil antler bone from a giant moose. And they just label it as that, giant moose, that's all they say. So conveniently, down at the front door, they had two moose who had gotten in a fight, gotten their antlers caught together, and they died, they starved to death, presumably, because they couldn't get their antlers apart. So they have these two tangled antlers together. So conveniently, we had two modern moose down at the front door to compare to the fossil moose. These ones were only 12 inches across on the beam. These were 24 inches across on the beam. So if we extrapolate, moose today typically are 6, maybe 7 feet tall at the shoulders. So it's pretty safe to say, and there is actually one on display, I forget the name of the museum. It may be the Chicago Field Museum, in fact. I'm not sure about that. There is a fossil moose on display in a pretty major museum here in the US of a complete fossil moose, standing roughly 12 feet tall at the shoulders. That's a big moose. Okay, its antlers would probably touch the ceiling in here. Quick guess. Now, here is the fossil beaver, a reconstruction. Castorus ohioensis, you guessed it, came from Ohio. Again, 6 feet tall, tail to snout. That's a big beaver. I have here a fossil, which I'm sure some of you will recognize at least. Anybody recognize what that is? Shark's tooth, exactly. How do you know? I'm curious. Well, yes, that's true. It does. It looks like one. But how do you know what a shark's tooth looks like? Yeah? Where? On a beach? Oh, you saw him on a beach? Okay. The reason I ask is because most people see him on necklaces. That's why I asked. So a lot of people recognize these right off the bat. But again, when you compare the modern ones to the fossil ones, this was from a shark that was probably somewhere around 60 to 100 feet long. So here to that wall at least. Okay, Jaws was a wuss. Okay? Jaws was just a wuss. And again, as I mentioned previously, Calamites, which are still alive today, in the fossil record, got up to 60 feet tall, whereas today they only get maybe 3 feet tall at best. Fossil plants were huge in the past compared to what they are now. Those lepidodendron that I showed you photographs of at the Joggins Fossil Cliffs still today grow in my backyard. I had to go find them. I knew they were there, but it took a while to find them because they're only about this tall now. Yet that same plant got over 120 feet tall in the fossil record. Cattails, which today, 5-6 feet tall, 60 feet tall in the fossil record. What on earth happened here? And how does this play a role in our interpretation of the fossil record? Now, interestingly, a friend of mine, Canadian Lawrence Tisdall, he's the president of the Creation Science Association of Quebec, during his studies in university, took a raspberry plant. He put it in a 100% humidity environment. That's all he changed. And this plant, which always produces 3 leaves, suddenly only grew 1 leaf. Now, if we were to find that in the fossil record, an evolutionist might look at that plant and say it's a raspberry plant, but it's only got 1 leaf. but today they have 3. They must have evolved 2 other leaves in an attempt to improve and to get better and to take in more energy. In actual fact, it's the other way around. The 3 leaves were necessary because the environment was worse. What may be an indicator to some evolutionists of evolution is actually only an indicator of environment. And that these raspberry plants are simply programmed to do things like that. It's dead easy. It's not evolution, that's microevolution. Again, you saw the variation just within the dogs. That is microevolution. I don't like the term, but I have no problem with it. We'll come back to that later on. Darwin's finches, that's another thing I got to add in too. There's a cast of this also on display now in Glendive, Montana. Otis Klein is building a gigantic creation museum there. So he has this fossil turtle on display there, except this is no ordinary turtle. This turtle is about 14 feet across on the shell. That is a big turtle. Okay, again, dragonflies. Yes, we do find them. This one came from the Solnhofen Formation, 4-foot wingspan, okay? Forget your windshield, boy. Can you imagine the tennis racket you need to take those guys out? Okay. A couple of years ago, National Geographic ran a documentary on the super croc, Sarcosuchus imperator. And I loved their advertisement for it. It didn't walk with the dinosaurs. It ate them. So yeah, it was great. So, still around today. Nothing's changed. How do we know it's the same? It looks the same. Still around today, but check out the size. That crocodile was about 45 feet long in the past. Big crocodile. Now, unfortunately, this is my dad that's right now battling for his life in ICU, but I got him in the picture for scale. These are fossil buffalo horns from a buffalo, which today might stand 4 feet, 5 feet tall at the shoulders, but in the fossil record, that same buffalo stood about 10 feet tall at the shoulders. Everything was larger in the past, including cockroaches. There's a modern one. Nice, cute little cockroach. That's actually a pretty big cockroach, but in the fossil record, that same cockroach is about 1 foot long. Pretty disgusting. So let's sum it all up here. Here is a 6-foot-tall guy standing in the corner for scale. He's got his 12-inch pet cockroach sitting on his shoulder. Armadillos, still around today, found in the fossil record, about 6 feet long. That's not the same as the glyptodont, which is the one I told you about the other day, found in the Antarctic. The fossil footprint from the cat that I told you about. Well, there's the nice kitty cat standing about 6 feet tall at the shoulders. Again, based on this fossil footprint. The dragonfly, there it is up top, as well as the giant moose. My friend Joe Taylor has excavated bones of a camel, fossil camel down in Texas. He figured it was roughly 20 feet tall, 19, 20 feet tall, give or take. There's our 10-foot tall bison. The donkey, the giant fossil donkey, standing roughly 9 feet tall, give or take. Then let's move upscale. Here's our 6-foot-tall man still standing in the corner. I had to put a 747 jumbo jet in for size because now everything's just so big. There's our fossil cattails. I don't have the calamites in here, the fossil horsetails, but they're about the same height, which is the same height as the tail on a 747 jumbo jet as it sits on the ground, give or take. There's the lepidodendron, today known as the club moss. That tells it all right there. Club moss, club tree, same thing. Yeah. And of course, our giant Sarcosuchus imperator and Megalodon, the giant shark, emphasis on mega. So, bearing all that in mind, we're going to take a look at the fossil record. But first, we're going to take a break. So I'm going to back up a presentation, and we're going to talk about the biology of things here, because that's a major part that I somehow missed. And what I'll do is tonight we'll explain the giantism, we'll explain the flood. Tomorrow we'll get into the hominids and the intermediate fossils, and we'll go into them in detail tomorrow. What I want to focus in on during this session, we've been talking about time, how the time just simply isn't there, how the deep time, the millions of years, the billions of years, I think I've kind of flogged that fossil equine to death. It was already dead, but we flogged it some more anyway. But what I want to get into now is let's give the evolutionists their time they want. Let's give it to them. You want your time? You want your millions of years? Go for it. You can have it. The point I want to focus on here is that even if they have the time, time does not solve the problems for evolution. It actually creates more problems for evolution. So not only does it not solve the problems, it actually causes fatal problems to the theory of evolution. Now, George Walt, way back in 1954, he later became the Nobel Prize winner in medicine, made a statement which has been quoted right, left, and center by both evolutionists and creationists alike. And he was talking about evolution and its time's role in evolution. So time is the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs miracles. The other thing I want to focus on this morning is that if you are an evolutionist, you believe in miracles. You believe in the supernatural. Don't you dare criticize Christians and creationists for calling upon the supernatural, because you as an atheist or evolutionist do it just as much. The metaphysical, the supernatural, the extranatural are all the same thing, a miracle. And whether you are a creationist or an evolutionist, you believe in miracles. So, let's take a look at how time is going to help us, supposedly, by producing life. Now, if you ask the evolutionists, it depends on who you ask, you get a different time all the time. And that time seems to increase each year, each year that goes on. The time evolution needs seems to increase a little bit, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to randomly build life by unguided processes, okay? So, in other words, remember, creation operates by guided processes. We have a supernatural creator guiding the process, building life, making life from scratch. Evolution has no intelligence, no guidance. Therefore, it's blind luck. Can blind chance form the seeing eye? Nope. It can't even make some of the basic building blocks of life. Let's take a look at it mathematically speaking. Proteins are the basic building blocks of life. They are made up of amino acids. So think of them something like Lego. With amino acids, you have roughly 20 amino acids to call upon. There's 20 different amino acids that join together in different sequences, which folds proteins in just the correct shape to make the amazing living things we see around us today. So if we have 20 different pieces of Lego to choose from, if we take 2 of them, how many different combinations can we get 2 in a row? 400 different combinations. Because you have 20 to choose from the first one, 20 from the second one. 20 times 20 is 400. If you have 3 different Legos, you have 20 to choose from. You have 8,000 combinations. 20 times 20 times 20. You follow me so far? Okay, so how many would you get from 4? How many different combinations? Hey, you got it. Okay. Someone drank their coffee this morning. All right, 160,000. That's right. So you'd have 160,000 different combinations. You can start to see where the numbers come from when you see the numbers. I'll give you in a second that Sir Francis Crick brought up. Now, it's very important that the amino acids, like Lego, be put together in a very specific sequence. If you have the wrong part, it doesn't make the correct mechanism. It doesn't make the correct building block. So, like Lego, if you get one piece in the wrong place, you wind up not making the ultimate object you're trying to make. Exact same problem. So we join Legos together, piece by piece, until finally we get life. Okay? In this case, it's a Wookiee, but anyway. Now, Sir Francis Crick, credited with the co-discovery of the spiral in the DNA, that twisted ladder shape. He was co-discoverer of that. Brought out as an example one protein 200 amino acids long. This is a typical protein. It said a typical protein 200 amino acids long has roughly 10 followed by 260 zeros 10 to the power of 260 different combinations that you can get using 20 amino acids, 200 amino acids long. Written out, there's the number. 10 followed by 260 zeros. That's how many different combinations you can get putting 20 amino acids together, 200 amino acids in a row. Now, typical evolutionist would claim that the universe is 20 billion years old. Depends on who you ask. That's what you get, okay? How many seconds are there in 20 billion years? Let's do the math. 20 billion times 365 days times 24 hours times 60 minutes times 60 seconds. Drum roll, please. Well, somebody, come on, okay. 630 quintillion, 720 trillion seconds in 20 billion years. Gee, it looks like an awful small number now, doesn't it? All of a sudden. Let's do some math. You have this many different combinations you have to try to get the correct combination for one protein. You only have a mere 630 quintillion, 720 trillion seconds to try all of those combinations. So, dividing that into that, you get this number. Written out, this is how many changes you need to make per second for 20 billion years to make one protein by unguided processes. This all came from my good friend Stan Lutz, who is a creationist in Washington. Basically had this little revelation while he was driving the car one day, and he felt the Lord opened his eyes for a second, and he just saw it in a jiffy. Oh, yeah, that's kind of impossible, isn't it? Yeah, I'll say. Now let's take a look at what that means. Remember, this is to make one protein by unguided processes. If you have a skilled person, they can build something quickly, can't they? But if you have a person that's less intelligent and less skilled, it takes them longer to accomplish the same job, correct? So, when you are dealing with a creator God, you have infinite knowledge, infinite skill, omniscient, all-powerful, so he can make life like that. If you have evolution, which has no intelligence, no skill, no guidance, no direction, it takes an infinite amount of time. 20 billion years is not enough time. Notice now it leaves a gap. And so when the next protein comes into place, it only has one place to go. It is guided by the cap into place and glued in place. That attracts this leg and this leg, leaving a gap here, where the next protein assembly coming up will then get directed into place and glued into place. And it builds it up like that for 30,000 proteins just to make one flagellum tail.